Welcome, friends, to Historian AFK. Tonight, we're going to step back into the shadowy, confusing, and often terrifying world of medicine in the Middle Ages. Our focus is on the medieval doctor, the men who were supposed to heal, but often caused more suffering than the illness itself. Before we get started, I'd love to know a little something from you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? It's always fascinating to see this little community stretching across the world, tuning in from different corners of the globe, sharing the same strange journey through history together. So dim the lights, let your mind slow down. Maybe let the hum of the background ease you into rest. Because what we're about to explore isn't glamorous, it isn't noble, and it certainly isn't safe. Tonight, we ask a simple but chilling question. What was it really like to be a doctor in the Middle Ages? And more importantly, why did it suck so badly? To begin, we need to set aside our modern ideas of medicine. Today, we think of doctors as figures of authority, armed with science, technology, and years of specialized training. They diagnose with X-rays and lab results. They prescribe carefully measured drugs. And though mistakes still happen, we trust them to know more than we do. But in medieval Europe, the word doctor meant something very different. These were men whose authority came not from knowledge of the human body, because quite frankly, they had very little of it, but from ancient texts, church approval, and a great deal of guesswork. A medieval doctor might recite passages from Hippocrates or Galen. Men who had written centuries before Christ was even born, but he had almost no practical tools to help you. Surgery was rare and frightening. Medicine was a cocktail of herbs, animal parts, and minerals, many of which were dangerous. And when illness swept through a town, doctors were as likely to flee as they were to cure. Imagine this. You wake up one morning in a medieval town. The air is damp, the streets are crowded, and someone in your household is burning with fever. You send for the doctor, the most respected man you can afford. He arrives with a long robe, a heavy cloak, and perhaps a hood that hides his face. He doesn't bring a stethoscope or a bag of clean instruments. Instead, he carries a worn book of remedies, a few pouches of herbs, and maybe, if he's especially proud, a jar of leeches. He looks at your loved one, mutters a prayer, then tells you the body is unbalanced. Too much blood, or perhaps too much phlegm. The cure? He'll cut a vein and let it drip into a bowl, believing that draining life away will restore balance. For the patient, it was agony. For the doctor, it was routine. And for the family watching, it was the price of hope. Being a doctor in this era wasn't just hard. Because of the lack of tools, it was hard because no one truly understood how the human body worked. Dissection was frowned upon, often outright forbidden by church law. Anatomy lessons relied on animal corpses or dusty old drawings. A doctor might never have seen the inside of a human body, yet he was expected to heal it. Imagine being in that position, given respect, money, and responsibility, yet having no real ability to deliver results. Every cough, every rash, every plague outbreak placed you in the spotlight, and when patients died, as they often did, the blame landed squarely on you. And then there was the danger. Doctors didn't just observe illness from a safe distance. They were exposed to the worst of it: leprosy, plague, smallpox, fevers with names long forgotten. With no concept of germs, they walked into homes filled with disease, armed with little more than incense, vinegar, or talismans. They risked their lives constantly, and many paid the price. The truth is, medieval doctors weren't admired heroes. They were often feared, mistrusted, even hated. The common folk sometimes preferred local wise women or herbalists, who at least seemed to understand practical remedies. Doctors, on the other hand, charged high fees, spoke in riddles, and frequently left their patients worse than before. And yet, for all this, they clung to their role, because being a doctor meant something powerful: status, education, and access to the wealthy. This is the world we are stepping into. A world where medicine was a mix of superstition, faith, fragments of ancient science, and outright guesswork. A world where people bled themselves to death, drank mercury, or carried amulets against the plague. A world where doctors were caught between desperation and ignorance, trying to heal with tools that harmed, bound by beliefs that blinded them. So tonight, we'll unravel what it truly meant to live as a doctor in the Middle Ages. We'll walk through their strange theories of humors, their terrifying tools, their reliance on astrology and divine signs, and of course, the haunting figure of the plague doctor with his long beaked mask. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why being a medieval doctor wasn't just unpleasant. It was downright miserable. This is not a tale of miracles or progress. It is a tale of suffering, confusion, and survival. And if you think your modern doctor's bill is painful, wait until you hear what it cost in blood, coin, and dignity to be treated in the Middle Ages. Let's turn now to the very foundation of medieval medicine, the framework that guided nearly every diagnosis, every prescription, and every treatment: the four humors. Without understanding this strange and often harmful belief system, you can't fully grasp why medieval doctors acted the way they did. The idea came not from the Middle Ages themselves, but from much earlier, passed down like a fragile torch from the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates and the Roman Dr. Galen. These men, writing centuries before the medieval world began, believed that the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, they argued, was simply a matter of balance. Too much of one humor or too little of another, and you fell ill. It sounded logical enough in an age with no microscopes, no germ theory, and no concept of bacteria. The theory was elegant, simple, and tragically completely wrong. Yet this was the model medieval doctors clung to with iron grip. For them, every ache, every fever, every strange swelling could be explained by an excess or deficiency of a humor. If your skin was flushed and hot, clearly you had too much blood. If you were sluggish, pale, and weak, perhaps black bile was overwhelming you. Suffering from coughing and chest congestion? That was phlegm. Irritable, restless, and feverish? Then yellow bile must be surging through your veins. Once a diagnosis was made, the treatments followed a grimly predictable pattern. To reduce blood, the most common method was bleeding. Doctors would open a vein with a knife or a lancet and allow blood to flow into a bowl until the patient weakened or fainted. Leeches were also popular, carefully placed on the skin to suck away what was thought to be the excess humor. Phlegm, meanwhile, was treated with expectorants or by inducing vomiting. Bile, both yellow and black, was fought with purges, powerful laxatives that emptied the bowels and left patients exhausted. It was a brutal routine, and it often harmed far more than it helped. Imagine a man already weakened by fever, having a pint of blood drained from his body. Imagine a woman suffering from malnutrition, being dosed with a violent purge until she could no longer stand. These treatments didn't restore balance, they stripped strength. But because recovery was often slow and unpredictable anyway, doctors could always claim success if a patient improved by chance. And if the patient died, well, clearly the imbalance was too severe to be corrected. The humors weren't just about medicine. They were tied into every aspect of medieval culture, shaping not just health, but personality, behavior, and even morality. People believed your temperament, whether you were cheerful, melancholic, angry, or calm, was dictated by which humor dominated your body. A sanguine person, full of blood, was merry and sociable. A choleric soul, ruled by yellow bile, was fiery and quick-tempered. Those with excess black bile were gloomy and prone to sadness, while phlegmatic individuals were calm, even lazy. This blending of medical theory with character judgment meant that illness wasn't just a physical condition. It was a reflection of who you were as a person. Doctors reinforced this worldview at every turn. If a nobleman was irritable and harsh, his advisors might suggest a regimen to calm his yellow bile. If a young woman was pale and withdrawn, her family might believe black bile was corrupting her spirit. Remedies were tailored not just to treat symptoms, but to mold character, to make people more virtuous, or at least more tolerable to live with. Of course, such treatments had little basis in reality. The blood, bile, and phlegm inside the body didn't operate in neat categories. But medieval doctors didn't have the means to test or disprove the theory. There were no microscopes to reveal microbes, no chemical tests to measure infection, no antibiotics to prove that disease could be fought directly. The humors endured because they offered certainty in a world of uncertainty. Astoundingly, even diet was dictated by humor theory. Every food was believed to have qualities, hot, cold, wet, or dry, that influenced the body's balance. Too much meat? You risked heating your blood and stirring aggression. Too much fish? That could increase your phlegm and make you sluggish. Red wine, bread, garlic, onions, herbs, all of it was classified and prescribed not just for flavor, but for its imagined effect on your humors. A doctor might forbid a feverish man from eating roasted meat, insisting instead on cold cucumbers or watered wine to cool his overheated system. This wasn't harmless advice. It shaped the way entire societies ate and lived. Monks in monasteries designed their diets to avoid humor imbalances. Kings consulted physicians about which dishes to serve at feasts. Even peasants absorbed the idea, adjusting their meals when they could, though hunger often left them with little choice. It's easy to laugh at now, but for a medieval doctor, this was serious business. His reputation, his livelihood, and sometimes his very safety depended on making the right call within this flawed system. If a nobleman's illness worsened after a round of bleeding, a doctor risked punishment, exile, or worse. Yet if the patient recovered by luck, the doctor could claim triumph, reinforcing the cycle of misplaced trust. There were moments when some questioned the system. A few bold thinkers observed that bloodletting often made patients weaker, not stronger. Others noticed that diseases seemed to spread person to person in ways humors couldn't explain. But the weight of tradition, the authority of Galen's writings, and the Church's approval kept the theory alive for centuries. It wasn't until the Renaissance and early modern period, with the rise of anatomy, dissection, and the microscope, that the humors were finally pushed aside. Still, for the people of the Middle Ages, the theory of humors explained everything from why they got sick to why their neighbor was moody. It was science, philosophy, and psychology all rolled into one. And for the doctor, it was both a lifeline and a curse, a framework to cling to, but one that condemned him to repeat mistakes endlessly. So, when we think of the medieval doctor, we must remember that he was trapped, not by cruelty, but by ignorance. He wasn't deliberately trying to harm. He was working with the only tools he had, ancient theories and blind faith in their power. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest truth of all. If we move from theory into practice, we arrive at one of the most unsettling aspects of medieval medicine, the tools doctors used. To modern eyes, these instruments look less like healing devices and more like something pulled from a torture chamber. But for a medieval doctor, they were essential proof that he had the skill and authority to intervene directly in the human body. The most common and widely recognized tool was the lancet, a small, sharp knife used for bloodletting. It was carried in a leather case, or even tucked into the folds of a robe, ready to be drawn at a moment's notice. When a patient was feverish, flushed, or simply considered overfull of blood, the doctor would make a neat incision in a vein and let it flow into a bowl. Sometimes the blood was measured against the phases of the moon, because many believed celestial bodies influenced the body's humors. A doctor might look up at the sky before deciding exactly how much blood to drain. Too much could kill. Too little and the patient might be deemed incurable. Then there were leeches. These little creatures were farmed, collected, and kept in jars of water, ready to be applied to a patient's skin. Doctors claimed leeches were more gentle than knives, drawing blood gradually rather than in sudden gushes. But the experience was hardly pleasant. The leeches could be difficult to remove, often leaving wounds that festered. Yet they were a staple of medieval practice, sold by apothecaries and recommended in treatises as the refined alternative to steel blades. Beyond bloodletting, medieval doctors used cauterization, burning a wound shut with a heated iron. This was used for injuries, amputations, and even some infections. The searing pain was thought to drive out bad humors and seal the body from further corruption. In practice, it caused immense suffering and frequently led to more infection, since the concept of sterilization didn't exist. Imagine the scene: a patient restrained by family or assistants, a doctor holding a glowing iron rod, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. For the doctor, it was a demonstration of knowledge. For the patient, it was agony. Trepanation was another grim procedure, the act of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull to release evil spirits, or to balance humors in cases of seizures and head trauma. Archaeological evidence shows that trepan skulls survived from many cultures, including medieval Europe. Astonishingly, some patients did survive, their bone healing over the wound. But many did not. The tools were crude, the risk of infection enormous, and anesthesia non-existent. Still, doctors insisted this could relieve pressure or cure madness. Amputations were sometimes performed, though usually by barber surgeons rather than learned doctors. The tools here were saws, knives, and hooks, used quickly to cut away infected limbs before rot spread further. Bandages might be dipped in wine or vinegar in a rough attempt at cleansing, but more often than not, patients died from shock, blood loss, or sepsis. Those who survived were left scarred and crippled, though sometimes grateful that at least part of them was saved. Not all instruments were sharp or violent. Doctors also carried tools for diagnosis urine flasks in particular. Uroscopy, the practice of examining urine, was a cornerstone of medieval medicine. Patients were often asked to provide a sample, which was then held up to the light in a special glass flask. The doctor studied its color, smell, and even taste, believing these revealed the balance of humors inside the body. Yellow urine suggested bile, pale urine indicated phlegm, and cloudy urine could mean corruption. Charts were drawn, cataloging every possible shade. Entire manuals were written on the art of urine analysis. So central was this practice that the image of a doctor holding a urine flask became a visual shorthand for the profession. Other diagnostic methods included checking the pulse, inspecting the tongue, and examining the skin. But these were all filtered through the lens of humors, not through observation of germs or bacteria. If a patient had spots, it was blamed on overheated blood. If the pulse was weak, phlegm was thought to be drowning vitality. And then there were the remedies. Doctors prescribed powders made from crushed gemstones, believed to carry healing energies. They offered potions of ground-up herbs, spices, or even dried animal parts. Mandrake root, opium, and henbane were occasionally used as sedatives, though dosages were wildly inconsistent. Some remedies were harmless, even helpful, like chamomile tea or honey for wounds. Others were outright poisonous. Mercury, arsenic, and lead found their way into medical recipes, slowly killing the very people they were meant to cure. The mixing of medicines was done with mortar and pestle, stored in jars and carefully labeled according to medieval pharmacopoeias, but accuracy was nearly impossible. One apothecary might prepare a digestive powder with cinnamon and ginger, while another added chalk and clay. Patients swallowed these concoctions with hope, never knowing whether they'd be eased or poisoned. What's remarkable is how much overlap there was between doctors and other trades. Barbers doubled as surgeons, pulling teeth, lancing boils, and setting broken bones. Apothecaries provided medicines, often with more practical skill than the doctors themselves. And midwives handled childbirth, sometimes more successfully than learned physicians who viewed the process as beneath them. The result was a patchwork of care, with tools ranging from barber's razors to kitchen herbs. Looking at these instruments and methods today, it's hard not to see the desperation behind them. A doctor's toolkit was less about precision and more about persuasion. Each blade, leech, and flask was a performance, meant to reassure patients that something was being done. The suffering was immense, the results unpredictable. But in a world where disease was everywhere and explanations were few, these tools carried the weight of authority. For the medieval doctor, carrying such instruments gave him power. For the patient, seeing them meant both hope and dread. And for us, centuries later, they serve as grim reminders of how far medicine has come and how terrifying it once was. If we step away from knives and leeches for a moment, we find ourselves in a quieter but no less puzzling part of the medieval doctor's world: the stars, the planets, and the unseen forces of magic. It may sound strange, but for a physician in the Middle Ages, astrology was as vital as a scalpel, and charms or prayers were as important as herbs. This wasn't seen as superstition. It was the mainstream. Medieval medicine was built on the idea that the human body and the wider universe were linked in a delicate harmony. What happened in the heavens influenced what happened in the veins, and a wise doctor was expected to read the stars just as carefully as he examined a patient's urine. The belief came from far older traditions. Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Roman authorities like Galen, whose words were treated almost as sacred scripture in the Middle Ages, both suggested that the cosmos affected the body. Later, during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars such as Avicenna preserved and expanded these ideas. Their writings, translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, flowed into European universities and shaped the way physicians were trained. By the 14th century, astrology was not just an optional skill for doctors. It was an essential part of their education. Medical students in Bologna, Paris, and Montpellier didn't only learn to recite the humors theory or identify herbs. They also learned how to cast horoscopes. They were taught to chart the sky at the moment a patient fell ill and to interpret how the alignment of planets might predict the outcome. Was recovery likely, or would death soon follow? For them, the stars offered not just guidance but authority. Astrology even had a physical presence in the doctor's world. If you walked into an apothecary or a hospital, you might see a large chart of the human body with zodiac signs painted on it. Aries was drawn over the head, Taurus over the neck, Gemini over the arms, Cancer the chest, Leo the heart, and so on, all the way down to Pisces at the feet. These zodiac man diagrams were used to decide where and when bloodletting or surgery could be safely attempted. A doctor would literally check the stars before picking up his knife. This belief reached into everyday life. If you were feverish, your physician might delay bleeding until the moon was waning. If you suffered from headaches, he might warn against cutting or even combing the hair when the moon was in Aries. Pregnant women were advised to avoid certain foods during particular alignments. Families sometimes postponed calling the doctor until an auspicious hour arrived. In noble households, entire treatments could be delayed for days because the stars weren't right. But astrology was only one half of this story. The other half was magic, and here, things grew even stranger. Doctors prescribed charms and amulets as if they were medicine. A patient might be told to wear a pouch filled with herbs like sage or rue, sewn shut with red thread and hung around the neck. Others carried gemstones, believed to counteract bad humors. Some physicians wrote Latin prayers or Bible verses on parchment, rolled them into tubes, and tied them with string so the patient could wear them close to the body. In especially desperate cases, these charms were soaked in wine and the patient was instructed to drink the liquid, literally swallowing the words of healing. The remedies could get even more peculiar. A sick child might be passed 3 times through the split trunk of a tree at sunrise to draw the illness away. A man struggling with melancholy could be told to drink wine poured beneath a particular constellation. Women in childbirth sometimes wore belts inscribed with astrological symbols, believing the stars themselves would ease the pain. Archaeologists have even uncovered amulets and talismans that belong to physicians' tiny bronze charms marked with planetary symbols, beads carved with protective prayers, and rings etched with zodiac signs. These weren't the tools of quacks on the margins of society. They were the equipment of trained doctors, respected by nobles and priests alike. The church had a complicated relationship with all this. On the one hand, astrology was tolerated if it was framed as astronomy, simply the study of God's heavens. After all, if God created the stars, then surely they had influence. On the other hand, predicting death, claiming magical powers, or dabbling too obviously in charms and incantations risked accusations of heresy. Doctors had to walk a very fine line. Too much stargazing, and they looked like sorcerers. Too little, and they risked losing credibility with patients who expected their illnesses to be explained in cosmic terms. For patients, these practices were reassuring. Illness was terrifying, often coming suddenly and without explanation. A child might sicken overnight. A plague might strike one town and spare another, and no one knew why. Astrology and magic offered a story. You were ill because Saturn was in the wrong place, or because your humors were disturbed under a certain star. A charm could realign those forces. And a doctor who understood the heavens seemed like someone with special access to hidden truth. But for the doctor, this was a burden. He wasn't only expected to heal the body. He was expected to read the cosmos. If a patient died, the family might whisper that he had misread the stars. If he avoided astrology, he might be dismissed as ignorant. He had to constantly juggle medicine, religion, and magic, knowing that his reputation, and sometimes his safety, depended on striking the right balance. So when we think of the medieval doctor, we shouldn't only picture the lancet or the leech. We should picture him hunched over parchment, carefully drawing a horoscope by candlelight. We should picture him tying charms, muttering prayers, and advising families to wait until Jupiter moved before attempting a treatment. His role was part physician, part astrologer, part magician. And that role, while it gave him authority, also trapped him in a system where success was often out of reach. This is another reason why being a doctor in the Middle Ages truly sucked. You were asked to heal with tools that harmed, but also to guide with stars that told you nothing. You were never just fighting disease. You were negotiating with the heavens, trying to comfort families, and keeping yourself safe from suspicion. Medicine was not only about health. It was about hope, fear, and belief, all stitched together in the fragile hands of a man who carried both a knife and a horoscope. When most people today picture medieval medicine, they see the eerie figure of the plague doctor. Tall, robed in black, with a bird-like beak mask jutting from his face, he looks more like a demon than a healer. And in many ways, that impression isn't wrong. The plague doctor wasn't a symbol of hope, but a symbol of desperation, fear, and failure in the face of Europe's deadliest epidemic, the Black Death. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347, spreading along trade routes from the east, carried by fleas on rats. Within just 5 years, it had killed tens of millions, wiping out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the continent's population. In town after town, whole families vanished, villages were abandoned, and cities became graveyards. No one understood infection. No one knew about bacteria. And yet, people looked to doctors to save them. The now famous beak mask actually came later in the 17th century, but it grew out of medieval attempts to protect physicians from what they thought was the cause of plague, bad air or miasma. The mask's long beak was packed with strong-smelling herbs, spices, and flowers, rosemary, lavender, cloves, or mint. Some stuffed vinegar-soaked cloth inside. The idea was that by purifying the foul smells, the doctor could avoid breathing in death itself. It didn't work against the plague bacterium, but it gave doctors a sense of control and perhaps a small barrier against other airborne hazards. The rest of the outfit was equally strange. A heavy waxed coat or cloak was worn, sometimes made of leather, designed to be wiped clean. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat completed the costume. And in one hand, the doctor carried a wooden cane, not for walking, but for poking patients from a distance, lifting clothing without touching, or even keeping desperate crowds at bay. The entire look made the plague doctor seem more like an executioner than a healer, and in some ways, the role wasn't far off. Despite the grim uniform, many plague doctors were not even trained physicians. In wealthy cities, a few university doctors did serve, but in most cases, towns hired whoever was willing. Contracts survived from Florence, Venice, and other Italian cities, promising plague doctors room, board, and pay in exchange for their services. Their duties often went beyond medicine. They were expected to record the number of sick and dead, write down wills for dying patients, supervise quarantines, and in some cases, even help bury the bodies. They were as much administrators of death as they were doctors of life. When they did attempt treatments, the results were rarely better than superstition. Buboes, swollen lumps caused by the plague, were lanced open with knives and seared with hot irons to draw out the poison. Patients were bled, purged with harsh laxatives, or forced to vomit in the hope of expelling bad humors. Poultices made from herbs, animal fat, or even live chickens were applied to sores. Yes, some doctors pressed a plucked chicken, still alive, onto a bubo, believing it would draw out the disease. The bird usually died, the patient rarely improved, but the ritual continued. Smoke was another favorite remedy. Doctors advised patients to sit in rooms filled with burning herbs, or even pitch and resin. Breathing in thick fumes meant to cleanse the lungs. Vinegar was poured over wounds or sprinkled in the air. Incantations and prayers were mixed in freely, since few believed medicine alone could conquer such terror. For the plague doctor himself, daily life was grim. He walked streets where carts carried away the dead. He entered homes where whole families lay motionless. He wrote wills for patients gasping their last breaths, recording what little wealth they had before sealing the house to prevent others from entering. He moved between hope and despair, fear and duty every day, and the work was dangerous. Many plague doctors died quickly, their protective gear offering little real defense against fleas, rats, and contact with the infected. Some contracts included clauses promising that if the doctor died, his family would receive compensation. In practice, many families were left with nothing. Some towns even refused to pay doctors once the plague passed, arguing that since their cures hadn't worked, the money was wasted. It truly sucked to be a plague doctor in every sense. Public perception was just as harsh. Some people saw plague doctors as sinister figures, spreading death rather than stopping it. Rumors circulated that they poisoned wells or deliberately killed the sick. Others treated them as necessary, but unwelcome presences, grim reminders that death was at the door. Children fled from them, and families often wept when they saw one approaching their street, and yet the image endured. Long after the plague, the costume of the plague doctor became a symbol of the medieval world's helplessness. The mask was remembered in plays, drawings, and later, even carnival costumes in Venice, where the bird-like mask was worn not as terror, but as theater. Today, it remains one of the most haunting icons of history, instantly recognizable as the face of disease and despair. Looking back, we might wonder why anyone chose the job. The answer is simple: money. In a time when most people were terrified to go near the sick, plague doctors could demand high wages. Some were paid in gold, others in free lodging, tax exemptions, or lifetime pensions. But most never lived to collect them. So why did it suck to be a plague doctor? Because you walked every day into death's shadow. You carried tools that failed, or armor that didn't protect you, and bore the hatred and fear of the very people you tried to serve. Your name wasn't remembered for saving lives. It was remembered for walking, like a dark omen through streets littered with corpses. If bleeding and plague masks sounded grim, surgery in the Middle Ages was an ordeal almost beyond imagination. Picture yourself lying on a hard wooden table, your family holding your arms and legs, while a man approaches with knives, saws, and a bowl of bandages. There are no anesthetics, no sterile sheets, no morphine or chloroform to carry you away from the pain. The best you might hope for is a cup of strong wine, a rag soaked in vinegar, or a whispered prayer that God would lend you strength. For most patients, surgery was a waking nightmare, endured from the first cut to the last cauterizing burn. In most towns, the men who performed surgery weren't the learned physicians in flowing robes. Those men thought themselves too educated to do the dirty work of cutting flesh. Instead, surgery fell into the hands of barber surgeons. Yes, the same people who shaved beards and trimmed hair also reset broken bones, stitched wounds, and cut away diseased flesh. The red and white barber's pole still standing outside some shops is a leftover symbol of that grisly past red for blood, white for bandages, a silent memory of when a shave and an amputation were both services on offer. The procedures they carried out varied from the practical to the horrific. Resetting broken bones was common, especially in a world where farming accidents, falls, and battlefield injuries happened daily. Limbs were pulled back into place, sometimes crudely, then bound tightly with wooden splints and linen strips. Arrow wounds were another constant problem. Soldiers and peasants alike might come to the barber surgeon with an iron arrowhead lodged deep in muscle. The surgeon used hooks and probes to drag the metal free, sometimes cutting deeper to reach it. Blood loss was a constant threat, but the only choice was to endure. Abscesses and tumors were sliced open with heated knives. Hernias were cut and stitched with thread thick enough to scrape flesh raw. Cataracts were treated by couching, a procedure in which a sharp needle was pushed into the eye to shove the cloudy lens aside. The patient would be left partially blind, but sometimes able to see shapes again. And then there was lithotomy, the removal of bladder stones. A patient with agonizing stones would be held down as the surgeon cut into the perineum to reach the bladder and extract the stone by hand or with crude forceps. Many died of infection or blood loss, but a few survived, and those who did could only marvel at being alive after such torment. Perhaps nothing was more dreaded than amputation. If infection or gangrene took hold in a limb, the only hope of survival was to cut it off. The surgeon worked quickly, often in just a few minutes, to slice through muscle and saw through bone. Assistants held the patient still as he screamed, fainted, or thrashed against the ropes. The stump was then sealed by cauterization, pressing a red-hot iron to the flesh to close the wound in fire. The smell of burning skin filled the air, and families outside could hear the screams. It was not unusual for patients to die on the table from shock alone, their bodies overwhelmed by agony. Even when the patient survived the cutting, infection followed close behind. Surgeons had no knowledge of germs. They moved from one patient to another with the same knives, often wiping blades on their leather aprons. Instruments might be rinsed in wine or water, but never properly sterilized. Bandages were reused until they rotted. Pus, swelling, and fever were not recognized as signs of sepsis, but were interpreted as the body expelling bad humors. Death was so common that survival was sometimes attributed more to God as mercy than to the surgeon as skill. Still, surgery was not all chaos. In some towns and universities, surgeons tried to codify their knowledge. Manuals were written describing how to treat wounds, how to amputate properly, and even how to stop bleeding by cautery or pressure. Famous names like Guy de Chauliac in the 14th century and Henry de Mondeville before him began to teach that surgery was a craft with rules, not just improvisation. They described stitching techniques, ointments made of honey and vinegar, and ways to manage fractures. Yet their influence was slow, and most surgeons still relied on what they had learned through apprenticeship, battlefield experience, or sheer trial and error. On the battlefield, surgery was a brutal necessity. Armies created more injuries than any town barber ever saw. Surgeons marched with troops, pulling arrows from bodies, binding wounds with whatever cloth they could find, and hacking off limbs to save men from dying of rot. The stench of blood, sweat, and unwashed bodies clung to them, and many surgeons themselves fell ill from infection. In war, speed mattered even more. A man had to be patched up quickly enough to march or left behind to die. Soldiers both feared and respected surgeons, knowing that their only chance of survival might come at the cost of unbearable pain. In villages, things could be slightly calmer, but no less dangerous. Families often stood in the room, helping to hold down the patient or praying loudly as the knife went in. Children sometimes witnessed the operations, growing up with the memory of screams echoing in their ears. Aftercare was minimal. Honey was smeared on wounds because it seemed to help them heal more cleanly. Vinegar was poured to cleanse, and cloths were tied tight to stop bleeding. Monasteries occasionally offered better recovery, with monks tending the sick in infirmaries, using herbs, wine, and constant prayer. But even there, the survival rate was low. Archaeological evidence tells us that some patients did survive. Skeletons have been found with amputated limbs that healed, showing bone growth and rounded stumps. These were the lucky ones, men and women who endured the saw, survived the infection, and lived unmarked forever by their scars. They remind us that medieval surgery, though often lethal, was not entirely hopeless. Sometimes skill, strength, and sheer luck combined to snatch a life back from the grave. But for most, the ordeal was a nightmare. The surgeon's kit alone was enough to inspire dread knives, saws, chisels, and irons, often blood-stained from the last patient. The reputation of surgeons hovered between necessary evil and outright butchery. Physicians mocked them as men of knives, unworthy of intellectual respect. Patients whispered about them as butchers in aprons. And yet, when infection spread, when bones broke, when stones lodged in the bladder, people still knocked on their doors. There was no choice. This is why surgery in the Middle Ages truly sucked. It was pain without mercy, knowledge without science, and hope balanced on the edge of a rusty knife. Patients screamed, families prayed, and surgeons worked as quickly as they could, knowing death waited just beyond the door. A few lived to tell the tale. Most did not. For every healed bone or stitched wound, there were dozens of graves dug behind churches, filled with those who could not survive the knife. Surgery was not just a medical procedure. It was a gamble against agony itself, and almost everyone lost. When we picture medieval doctors, it's tempting to imagine them as wise men with years of careful study, but the truth was far more complicated. Medical training in the Middle Ages was a strange mixture of learning, memorization, ritual, and tradition, often more about repeating what ancient authors had written than discovering anything new. Universities did exist, and medicine was one of their most respected faculties, but what they taught and how doctors were trained reveals just how limited and outdated the practice often was. By the 12th and 13th centuries, great medical schools had emerged in Europe, especially in places like Salerno in Italy, Montpellier in France, and later Paris and Bologna. These universities became famous, drawing students from across the continent. A young man hoping to become a physician would spend years memorizing Latin texts, studying Aristotle, Galen, and Hippocrates, as well as Islamic scholars like Avicenna, and Al-Razi. Their works, translated into Latin, formed the bedrock of medieval medicine. In fact, many of the most widely used textbooks had been written over 1,000 years earlier. The goal of a student was not to question these authorities, but to learn them by heart. A typical course of study might last 7 to 10 years. Students began with the liberal arts, the trivium and quadrivium, which included grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. Only then could they move on to medicine. Once admitted to the medical faculty, they spent their days in lecture halls, listening to professors read from Galen or Avicenna, pausing occasionally to explain or comment. There were few demonstrations, almost no dissections, and little practical training. Students rarely saw a patient until long after they had earned their degrees. Their education was intellectual rather than practical, based on theory and ancient authority rather than observation and experiment. The Church played a powerful role in shaping this system. For centuries, dissections of human bodies were forbidden or heavily restricted. Some exceptions were made. Executed criminals might be dissected in public for teaching purposes, but this was rare. Most knowledge of anatomy came from the writings of Galen, a Greek physician who had lived in the 2nd century. But Galen had studied animals, not humans. He dissected monkeys, pigs, and other creatures, and then assumed the same structures existed in people. Medieval doctors inherited his mistakes, repeating them without question. If a human dissection did contradict Galen, many teachers insisted the body must be abnormal, because Galen could not be wrong. Despite this, universities held enormous prestige. To call oneself a doctor was to claim an elite identity. Physicians wore long robes, spoke Latin, and held themselves above barber surgeons and apothecaries. They were men of books, not men of knives. Yet their lofty training often left them ill-prepared for the realities of disease. When plague or war struck, it was the surgeons, not the university doctors, who had the most practical skills. There were attempts at reform. In the 13th century, the University of Bologna became known for its anatomy lectures, where professors read aloud from Galen, while a surgeon performed the dissection on a human body, usually a criminal. The professor rarely touched the corpse himself. He stood above, reading, while the surgeon cut below. Students crowded around, straining to see, but the exercise was more about confirming Galen's words than discovering truth. Still, it was a step toward hands-on medicine. Montpellier, too, became famous for its medical school, drawing scholars from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions, and encouraging a slightly more practical approach. Apprenticeship also played a role. Many young men learned medicine by studying under established doctors, traveling with them, or serving as assistants. In towns, apprenticeships with barber surgeons taught practical skills like stitching wounds or setting bones, though these men rarely received the social status of physicians. Monasteries, too, acted as centers of healing. Monks studied herbal remedies, copied medical texts, and ran infirmaries. Their knowledge of plants and their care for the sick often made monastic medicine more effective than the learned prescriptions of university doctors. The curriculum itself reveals the strange mixture of science and superstition. Alongside anatomy and physiology, students were expected to learn astrology. The stars and planets were believed to influence health, and medical astrology was a required subject. Charts showing zodiac signs were used to decide when to bleed a patient, when to administer medicines, and when to avoid surgery. A well-trained physician was as much an astrologer as a doctor. Practical examinations were rare, but oral disputations were common. A student might be asked to debate a point from Galen or Avicenna, quoting the text in Latin and arguing from authority. Passing these tests proved he had mastered the knowledge of the ancients, not that he could cure a sick man. Once he graduated, he might be licensed by a town or by the church, and then set out to practice. His tools were limited bleeding, purging, herbal remedies, charms, and prayers, but his degree gave him prestige and the right to charge high fees. The gap between learning and practice was wide. On the battlefield, surgeons treated arrow wounds and broken bones with whatever skill they had, while physicians back in towns advised noble patients on diet, astrology, and humoral balance. Common people rarely saw a university-trained doctor. They relied instead on local healers, midwives, or apothecaries who dispensed herbs. The university doctor was often too expensive, too distant, and too bound by theory to be of much use to ordinary people. Even within universities, there were debates about the role of experience. Some argued that observation of patients should count as much as the study of texts. Others clung fiercely to authority, believing it was safer to trust the wisdom of Galen than the evidence of their own eyes. These tensions slowly laid the groundwork for later change, but in the Middle Ages, tradition usually won. And so to be a doctor in the medieval university system was to be highly educated, but often poorly prepared. You could recite Galen's theories in perfect Latin, explain how the four humors interacted, and predict illness based on the stars. But when a peasant brought you his sick child, or a soldier lay before you with a shattered arm, your training gave you little to offer beyond bleeding, prayer, or advice on diet. The patient's survival often depended less on the doctor as skill and more on the mercy of time and nature. This is why the training itself, though prestigious, was another reason it sucked to be a medieval doctor. The education was long, expensive, and deeply respected, yet it left its graduates trapped in outdated theories and blind to the realities of disease. They carried their robes and degrees with pride, but when plague or war swept across Europe, those long years of study often meant very little. Knowledge was revered, but healing remained elusive, and the gulf between book learning and human suffering was never greater than in the world of the medieval physician. To understand medieval medicine, you have to understand that religion wasn't just in the background, it was everywhere. The church wasn't simply a Sunday ritual. It was the center of life, law, and learning. And that meant medicine was shaped, restrained, and sometimes completely dominated by religious thought. For a medieval doctor, faith was as important as science, and often more powerful. Illness itself was seen through a spiritual lens. Many people believed sickness was punishment for sin, a test of faith, or even the work of demons. Plague, fevers, madness, these were not simply physical conditions, but divine messages. If God had sent the suffering, then prayer and repentance were the most natural cures. Pilgrimages to holy shrines became acts of healing. Relics of saints were carried through towns to ward off epidemics. Water from sacred springs was drunk like medicine. Monks copied manuscripts describing not only herbs and humors, but also the virtues of prayer, fasting, and confession. This wasn't just superstition, it was official teaching. Church councils debated what kinds of healing were acceptable, and priests often acted as healers themselves. In monasteries across Europe, infirmaries cared for the sick. Monks cultivated herb gardens, brewed tonics, and kept detailed records of remedies. Some monasteries became famous for their healing, drawing patients from miles away. Yet at the same time, they warned against treatments that seemed too close to magic. There was always a fine line between medicine and heresy. The church both restricted and preserved knowledge. On the one hand, it limited dissection and discouraged experimentation that contradicted established doctrine. On the other hand, monasteries preserved the very texts that formed the backbone of medical learning. Without monks copying Galen and Hippocrates, much of ancient medicine might have been lost to Europe. It was a strange paradox. The church slowed progress, but also ensured that some knowledge survived. Astrology, too, was tied to religion. While some church leaders condemned it as pagan, others allowed it if practiced as part of natural philosophy. Doctors might consult the stars before bleeding a patient or prescribing a purge. Charts showing zodiac signs were sometimes painted on the walls of hospitals. For many, It was not seen as heretical, but as another way of reading God's creation. Relics played a particularly strong role in healing. Pieces of saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, vials of holy oil, all were believed to carry miraculous power. The sick traveled long distances to touch or see these relics, hoping for cures. Towns that possessed famous relics became centers of pilgrimage, blending faith, commerce, and health. Doctors could not ignore this. Sometimes their best advice was simply to send a patient on a pilgrimage. Even when physicians treated with herbs or bloodletting, prayers often accompanied the act. A bleeding might be done while reciting the Lord's Prayer. A tonic might be blessed before being given. Healing was never just physical. It was spiritual warfare. To treat the body without caring for the soul was considered incomplete. The fear of sin hung heavily over women in medicine. Midwives, who were often the most skilled practical healers in villages, were sometimes accused of witchcraft if things went wrong. A baby born deformed, a mother who died in childbirth, an illness that worsened after treatment, these could all be used as evidence of demonic influence. Doctors themselves sometimes faced suspicion, but midwives and female healers bore the brunt of it. The church tolerated them only so long as they stayed within boundaries, relying on prayers and holy water as much as herbs. Hospitals themselves were religious institutions. They were not hospitals in the modern sense, focused on curing disease, but places of charity, founded by monasteries or bishops. Their primary goal was to care for the poor, the sick, and the dying, often with food, shelter, and prayer rather than advanced treatment. Patients might be fed, clothed, and comforted, but little more could be done. Healing was left to God. In times of plague, the church's influence became even stronger. Processions were held, bells were rung, masses were said for the dead and the dying. Flagellants, men who whipped themselves in public as penance for sin, marched from town to town, believing their suffering might appease God's wrath. Doctors often found themselves powerless, their remedies failing, while priests offered spiritual solutions. Some doctors joined the flagellants themselves, abandoning medicine for ritual. Yet it would be wrong to say that religion always blocked progress. Many medieval scholars, often clergy themselves, studied natural philosophy and sought to reconcile faith with observation. They believed God had created an orderly universe, and by studying it, one could learn his design. This belief gave medicine its moral legitimacy. It was not just a human craft, but a way of reading divine truth. Still, any discovery that contradicted Scripture risked condemnation, so bold innovation was rare. The weight of religious control is one of the reasons being a medieval doctor truly sucked. Even if you studied for years, even if you learned herbs, anatomy, and the art of healing, you were always bound by the church. You could not dissect freely. You could not challenge Galen openly. You could not experiment without fear. Your prescriptions had to include prayer as much as plants. Your failures were often blamed on sin rather than science. And the people you treated sometimes believed more in relics and pilgrimages than in your skill. This was the reality of medicine in a world where faith was law. Doctors were not just healers, but servants of both God and man, walking a narrow path between knowledge and obedience. Sometimes their faith gave them strength, but more often it chained them to old mistakes. And so medieval medicine remained caught in the grip of the church half science, half salvation, and never free to be either fully. If we really want to see why it sucked to be a medieval doctor, we need to step into their shoes for a day. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a parade of grateful patients thanking them for miraculous cures. It was long hours of travel, endless consultations filled with uncertainty, and a constant balancing act between knowledge, performance, and survival. The day often began with prayer because medicine was seen as a sacred duty. A physician might rise before dawn, say the morning offices if he was religiously trained, and then prepare his instruments and charts. He carried with him the tools of his craft: flasks for urine analysis, astrological tables, bleeding lancets, and sometimes even a small chest of herbs and powders. His robe, often black or dark-colored, marked him as a man of learning, and it was as much part of his identity as his tools. Patients were as varied as the society itself. A nobleman or wealthy merchant expected a physician to act with ceremony, examining his urine carefully, perhaps asking detailed questions about his diet, sleeping habits, and the alignment of the stars at his birth. These consultations could last hours and might end with a prescription written in Latin, designed to be filled by an apothecary. For the rich, seeing a physician was partly about health and partly about prestige. To hire a university-trained doctor showed status. Poorer villagers had different needs. They wanted relief for fevers, poultices for wounds, help for children, or advice during childbirth. But they could rarely afford a physician's fees, which were often more than a day's wages. Payment might come in chickens, grain, or beer rather than silver coins. Many peasants turned instead to local healers, midwives, or herbalists who charged less and spoke in familiar terms. For university-trained doctors, this was humiliating. Years of study, and yet they were often competing with a woman carrying a basket of plants. The core of a doctor's daily work was diagnosis, and that meant rituals of observation. He would study the patient's complexion, feel the pulse, and most importantly, examine the urine. Urine flasks were held to the light, swirled, sniffed, and compared to charts that linked color and texture to the four humors. Pale urine might mean too much phlegm, dark urine too much black bile. It was part science, part performance. Families watched closely, hoping for certainty, but the doctor often had little more than educated guesswork to offer. Treatments followed familiar patterns. Bleeding was common, whether by lancet, leeches, or cupping. Timing was crucial, determined by astrological charts that showed which zodiac sign ruled which part of the body. Purges, too, were prescribed, using strong herbs to clear the bowels or induce vomiting. Diet was adjusted, lighter foods for hot fevers, heavier for cold humors. Baths, prayers, charms, pilgrimages, all could be recommended. The doctor himself rarely performed surgery. That was the work of barber surgeons. Instead, he acted as a learned consultant, guiding the treatment while others carried it out. The working day could be unpredictable. In cities, doctors might receive patients in their homes, sometimes in small chambers decorated with books and charts. In villages, they had to travel, riding for miles on rough roads. Travel itself was dangerous. Doctors carried money and goods, making them targets for thieves. They also carried disease, constantly exposed to sick patients. Many physicians died young, not from battlefield wounds, but from catching infections in crowded, pestilent homes. Payment was another source of stress. Nobles might promise payment, but delay for months or even years. Town councils sometimes regulated fees, demanding doctors charge less for the poor. Physicians wrote angry letters to complain about underpayment, and some abandoned rural practice altogether, preferring to serve only the wealthy who could afford them. Yet even nobles could be fickle. A doctor who failed to cure a nobleman's wife might be dismissed in disgrace, his reputation ruined. Doctors also faced constant rivalry. Apothecaries accused them of overcharging for prescriptions. Barber surgeons mocked them for avoiding the hard work of cutting and stitching. Midwives accused them of meddling in childbirth without understanding women's bodies. And the church sometimes condemned them for straying too far into astrology or superstition. A doctor's authority was always being questioned from every side. The social life of a physician reflected this tension. In taverns and markets, people spoke of them with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They were men of learning, but also objects of ridicule when their cures failed. Some towns required them to sit on councils or advise leaders, but this only tied them to politics and made them enemies as well as patients. Their robes in Latin set them apart, but isolation came at a cost. At night, their work rarely ended. They might be called to a sudden childbirth, a fevered child, or a nobleman struck with chest pains. They lit candles, consulted their books, prayed, and tried once again to balance humors that never seemed to obey. The cycle never stopped. The next morning, it began again. Prayer, travel, urine, guesses, remedies, payment, and exhaustion. And always, hanging over their heads, was failure. When a patient died, the doctor's reputation suffered. Families whispered, neighbors talked, and rivals gloated. Some deaths could be blamed on God's will, others on the patient's sins, but too many failures could destroy a career. Unlike modern doctors, they had no scientific shield, no antibiotics or proven cures. Their entire practice rested on fragile theory and hope. This was the daily grind of a medieval doctor. Long hours, uncertain knowledge, constant travel, poor pay, frequent danger, endless rivalry, and a reputation balanced on luck as much as skill. It demanded everything: study, ritual, authority, endurance, but gave little in return. And that, more than anything else, is why being a medieval doctor truly sucked. When you step back and look at the whole landscape of medieval medicine, the truth is sobering. To be a doctor in those centuries was not to be a healer in the modern sense. It was to be a man caught between hope and failure, between faith and science, between respect and ridicule. From the outside, physicians seemed like the learned elite of their world, wrapped in long robes, speaking Latin, advising kings and nobles. But beneath the surface, their lives were filled with doubt, risk, and a daily grind that wore them down. Their training alone was an ordeal. 10 years of study, memorizing Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, Aristotle texts centuries old, repeated without question. The young man who set out to learn medicine did not dissect bodies, did not practice on patients, did not experiment. He copied, recited, and debated in Latin until he was declared fit to advise the sick. And when he finally put his theories into practice, reality humbled him quickly. Disease did not bend to the neat diagrams of the four humors. Plague did not obey the stars. Patients died, and families whispered that he had failed. Day-to-day life was no gentler. Doctors rose early, prayed, and set off to visit patients scattered across villages and cities. They jostled along muddy roads, risking robbery, bad weather, and infection. They carried urine flasks, lancets, herbs, and charts in their heavy bags, knowing that most of what they prescribed would not cure but only comfort. A nobleman might pay in silver, a peasant in bread or beer. Sometimes patients paid nothing at all, and the doctor was left poorer than when he began. And always there was rivalry. Apothecaries accused doctors of arrogance. Surgeons mocked them for avoiding bloody work. Midwives defended their knowledge of childbirth, while the church demanded doctors tread carefully, lest they wander into heresy. A physician's authority was fragile, respected in one breath and mocked in the next. In taverns, stories spread of doctors who killed more than they cured. The church's shadow loomed over everything. Healing was as much about saving souls as saving bodies. To pray was as important as to prescribe. Pilgrimages, relics, and charms competed with herbs and diets. Dissection was restricted, innovation discouraged, and yet monasteries preserved the very texts that kept medicine alive. Doctors walked a tightrope, balancing piety with practice, never free to pursue knowledge fully. And then there was surgery, the nightmare of medieval healing. Though physicians often avoided it, they could not escape its reality. Amputations done without anesthesia, cauterizations that filled rooms with the smell of burning flesh, bladder stone removals so brutal they became infamous across Europe. Surgeons did the cutting, but doctors were often there, advising or watching, powerless to make the pain stop. They heard the screams, saw the deaths, and carried those memories home. Money was another constant worry. Nobles delayed payment. Villagers offered chickens instead of coin. Councils capped fees. Some doctors wrote desperate letters about unpaid bills. Prestige meant little when your children were hungry, or when you had to choose between buying new books and buying food. Worst of all, the risks were constant. Plague, leprosy, fevers, pox, all of these passed from patient to doctor with terrifying ease. The beaked masks stuffed with herbs offered no protection. Many physicians fled during epidemics, leaving towns to fend for themselves. Others stayed and died, martyrs not to science, but to desperation. The more patients they saw, the more likely they were to join them in the grave. And yet they endured. For all their failures, medieval doctors believed they were part of something greater. They preserved knowledge, even if it was flawed. They carried forward the names of Galen and Avicenna, Hippocrates and Aristotle, ensuring that when the Renaissance came, those texts were still there to be challenged and improved upon. In their fumbling way, they kept the flame of medicine alive. They failed more than they succeeded, but they did not give up, and that is why their lives were so difficult. Every day, they faced suffering they could not ease, diseases they could not stop, deaths they could not prevent. They carried the burden of expectation, the weight of superstition, the constant shadow of faith. They wore robes of prestige, but underneath, they were as helpless as the peasants who looked to them for hope. It was a profession of honor on the outside, but misery on the inside. So when we ask, why did it suck to be a medieval doctor? The answer is simple. It sucked because they knew less than they wanted, achieved less than they hoped, and bore more responsibility than any one person could manage. They were both respected and ridiculed, rich in knowledge but poor in results, and above all, trapped in a world that demanded miracles while offering them only theories. And now, as you settle back in your chair or lay your head against the pillow, take a moment to imagine those long ago men riding through the dark on muddy roads, carrying their flasks of urine and their hopes of healing. They did what they could with what they had, and though they failed more often than not, they were the fragile bridge between the ancient world and the modern. And with that thought, we'll close tonight's story. Thank you for joining me on this strange journey into the life of a medieval doctor. Rest easy, let your mind drift, and perhaps be grateful that if you fall ill tonight, you won't be handed a bleeding chart or a flask of your own urine. Good night, sleep well, and until next time.